Bear woke before the roosters because the wind had turned and the night air smelled like old ashes. A man who worked cattle as long as he had could tell the difference between a normal cold front rolling off the flats and something that drifted out of people's mistakes. This carried the sour hint of smoke and tallow and pride. He slid out of his bunk in the tack room behind Pete Morrison's livery, pulled on his coat, and stood listening to the town breathe. The boards creaked. A sign clapped once in the gust, and then went still as a prayer said too late. He crossed the alley and lifted the latch to the feed shed. Something thumped inside. Not a rat. Not a cat. Something cautious, trying to be a shadow. Bear squinted into the dark, and the dark stared back. Two eyes, black as creosote pools, peeking out between sacks of oats. He didn't reach for the rifle. He reached for the lantern string. When the wick caught, warm light flushed the little room and painted the dust like falling snow. The figure pressed deeper into the corner. A child, so thin the bones were a map under her skin, hair matted with wind-blown burrs, a scrap of deerskin tied around her shoulders like a promise that hadn't held. She didn't beg. She looked at him the way people look at a cliff, measuring the distance to fall. "Broken arrow," Bear said before he could stop himself. He had seen her once last spring, far out near the malpais where the land buckled like cooled lava. She'd been riding a pinto beside Chief White Bull, her father, the Comanche people strung out behind them like a moving seam of earth. She'd laughed at a meadowlark, and it had sounded like something the wind would want to keep. He didn't know how he remembered that, but he did. The girl didn't answer. She watched his hands the way a doe watches the draw, where hunters come from. He set the lantern on the floor and loosened a sack of oats to uncover last night's heel of bread in a tin. He tore off pieces. He did not come closer than the length of his arm, and he held the bread as you might hold something sacred that your own touch could spoil. She took the first piece without blinking. The second was faster. By the third, her fingers shook. "Easy," he said. "Nothing here will chase you." A floorboard popped behind him. Bear didn't turn because he recognized the weight and rhythm. Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison, who never knocked in a life full of doors. Jake spoke low. "You find what made that noise?" Bear shifted, keeping himself between the lantern and the girl. "Just a hungry creature." "Town's got plenty of those," Jake said, and then he saw. He took one step in, then another, the badge on his vest catching a brief blink of light. His face went still. Lord above. The child froze with the bread inches from her mouth. "Don't," Bear warned softly. Jake raised his hands, fingers spread. "It's all right, little one." He looked at Bear, and the look carried 10 questions and a warning besides. "I heard Reverend Thomas say last Sunday we should act as if the Lord might come around any corner. Looks like he beat us here." Bear cut another strip of bread. "She's Chief White Bull's daughter." "I can see that." Jake rubbed the sleep out of his eyes with the back of his wrist. "What's she doing in town?" "Starving, looks like." A gust leaned against the shed. The lantern hissed and steadied. Somewhere across the street a dog barked once, then thought better of it. And farther out on the edge of town, a steam wagon rattled on the road to Cletus Hartwell's north pasture. Hartwell, who said the land belonged to men who could pin it to paper, and called anyone without paper a trespasser. Jake angled his head toward the alley. "We should get her to Reverend Thomas. He'll know how to speak calm." "She won't walk with a badge," Bear said. "Not with the winter we've had." "You think Hartwell had a hand in it?" Bear didn't answer, which told Jake enough. They moved careful. Jake stood watch in the alley, while Bear wrapped Broken Arrow in a blanket and tucked the rest of the bread into the folds. She let him. Maybe because his hand stayed slow, or because he didn't ask her anything she couldn't answer with a nod. They went out into the thin dawn as if the town were sleeping with one angry eye open. Reverend Thomas lived behind the church, a small house built with donated lumber, every plank pried at least once from something else. He opened the door before Bear knocked. Pastors know the sound of trouble, the way blacksmiths know the pitch of hot iron. His beard was silver now, but his eyes still held the stubborn light of a man who believed mercy could be made muscular. "Bring her in," the Reverend said. "The stove's on." They moved the girl to the warm corner. Thomas didn't crowd her either. He set tea on the table and waited for the steam to speak its little sermon. When she finally reached for the tin cup, Bear felt his own shoulders loosen. Jake stood by the window, watching the street change color. "If she's here, the rest can't be far." "Or too far to help," Bear said. Thomas looked at both of them. "You think this runs through Cletus Hartwell?" It wasn't a question. Jake nodded. "He fenced the North Water. Put a man with a Remington at the gap. Called it protecting his rights." "Water has its own law," the Reverend said, and his voice made it sound older than the courthouse. Broken Arrow spoke then, in the low, even syllables of Comanche. Bear understood enough to follow. She pointed north with her chin, then west, then made a motion with her wrist like a hand smothering a small fire. He saw people in her eyes, not just words, women curling around children, old men with their good stories exhausted, riders too thin to ride far. "She says they're hungry," Bear translated, "and the buffalo didn't come. White Bull took them toward the river bend, but the water is fenced. Hardwell's men fired shots. They had to pull back." Jake's jaw worked. "Hartwell say the land deed gives him say-so. He's got the judge in his pocket." "Judges can read only what is said in front of them," Reverend Thomas replied. "Sometimes you must hand them something worth reading." He turned to Broken Arrow and knelt to place his hand in his own chest, then outward toward the door, a question if she wished him to go speak to her people, a promise to carry his heart in both hands while he did it. She looked to Bear, then back, then nodded once, slow as a sunrise. Thomas stood. "I can ride now. Jake, you best keep the wind from this girl." But Bear was already pulling on his coat. "I'll ride with you. She found me for a reason." Jake caught his sleeve. "If Hartwell hears you went to the camp, he'll call you an enemy. You'll lose work." "Work I can find," Bear said. "People, not so easy." Reverend Thomas fetched his old roan from the lean-to. Bear saddled his dun. They left by the back alleys, two horses soundless on winter dirt, and moved west between slow swells of ground that looked like a crouching herd. When they climbed the ridge above the river bend, they saw the truth set out below like writing you don't want to read. The Comanche camp was a circle of exhausted canvas and hope. Fires burned low, children bundled deep, old warriors with the breath of mountain goats but none of the spirit. White Bull stood near the largest fire, his braid white as a new scar. He did not reach for his rifle when Bear and the Reverend rode down. He had known Bear before, once over traded coffee and a borrowed knife edge. He watched the two riders dismount and let them come into the heat the way a man lets weather come. He cannot stop it, but he can face the wind. "Chief White Bull," Reverend Thomas said, with the little bow he saved for funerals and introductions he wanted to turn into friendships. We bring no weapons in our hands. White Bull looked at Bear. You carry the face of a man who has chosen something. Bear said, a girl came to town hungry. She found us. We came to tell you what you know. Hartwell's men keep the river as if it were a chest he bought from a catalog. White Bull's mouth bent at a corner. River is older than men with paper. He gestured, and a man led up a horse with a woven blanket tied at the withers. He flipped the blanket. 5 strips of fresh-cut hide hung there, small and even. We butchered our last thin cow yesterday. We left him his skin. It felt like taking a coat off a dead friend. Reverend Thomas closed his eyes a moment. We can carry food from town. The church pantry. Bear shook his head. Hartwell's men would block the road. White Bull waited without speaking, a man who knew that silence could cook an idea until it was fit to eat. We could go around. The Reverend tried again. South, through the basalt. A long ride, but Bear looked at the river, then at the willow clumps that had been cut down to chewed stubble by cattle that had no business here. He saw the fence, 4 strands of wire, staples hammered into posts peeled raw of bark, as if the land itself had been whipped. He saw a man leaning on the top wire with the slouch of someone who believes the world will stand on command. The man saw them and tapped the stock of his rifle with 2 gloved fingers like you would tap a table to call for dessert. This isn't about going around, Bear said. It's about whether men can choke a river. White Bull's gaze rested on Bear a long time. You speak like a man who knows both mercy and anger. Anger ain't the hard part, Bear said. Knowing when to stop using it is the work of a life. The chief gestured to a woman who had been listening, Broken Arrow's aunt, by the shape of her cheekbones and the way worry rode her eyes. She led forward a small figure wrapped in a patched blanket. The child lifted her head. It was Broken Arrow. Someone had traveled fast, faster than Bear thought possible, to return her home to ease her fears. She looked at him and did a thing that hurt more than a bullet. She smiled. It was small and tired and full of gratitude she couldn't pay with anything but her eyes. Bear swallowed, and the work of the day set its weight across his shoulders. They rode back along the river until they came to the place Hartwell's fence cut the bank like a scar sewn with bright wire. The man with the Remington took his time shouldering it, just enough to say he owned all the moments between here and sundown. Reverend Thomas edged his horse left so he could be seen clearly. Mornin', son. We're here in the Lord's business. The guard hawked and spat. Lord's business lives on Hartwell's land same as any other. Bear said, water isn't land. The guard squinted. You one of them thinkers? I'm a man who knows a thirsty child, Bear said. The guard set the rifle in the crook of his arm. You pour from your own canteen if you feel soft. This river's for stock with brands and men with deeds. White Bull's people did not gather on the ridge to watch. Pride keeps folk busy doing other things when their hunger needs a witness. But Bear felt them anyway, like a crowd at the far end of a prayer. Reverend Thomas tried the voice he used on men who wanted to put their troubles down without losing their pride. Tell Mr. Hartwell we wish to parley. Tell him I will remind him of his better angels. The guard laughed. Mr. Hartwell ain't got any angels, better or worse. He's got a timetable. Bear stepped closer, hands away from his sides, palms visible. We ain't here to cut your wires. We're here to open a gate. You open a gate without a key, the guard said. You're a thief. Sometimes the lock ain't legal, Bear replied. That a fact. The rifle twitched up just enough. Bear looked at the muzzle, then at the river. He thought of Broken Arrow's small hands tucked inside the blanket, and he decided the shape the day would take. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I'm a thief. I'm about to steal your certainty." He walked forward. It was a slow walk, the way a man approaches a skittish horse. The rifle came all the way up. Thomas sucked air. The wind went still as if it too were holding its breath. "Don't," Bear said calmly. "You're counting on my fear to do your work for you." He took one more step, then another, until the barrel touched his coat. He could feel the cold through the wool, feel the little tremor of the man on the other end, whose hands had never decided anything this important before now. Bear looked the guard in the eye, the way a teacher looks a boy learning his letters, and he saw the moment the man realized he did not want to kill someone whose only weapon was the truth of his intention. The rifle lowered. Not much. Enough. Bear reached past it and set 2 fingers on the top wire. He didn't push. He didn't lift. He just rested his hand there as if greeting a stubborn mule. Then he looked at the guard and said, "Let the children drink. Tell Mr. Hartwell he can ask a judge about the rest." Silence stretched, then sagged, then snapped. The guard jerked his chin. 2 hours. And if I lose my job, I'll find you." "I'll be easy to find," Bear said. "I'm the one who looks like me." They cut the wire at one post and slipped it back as neat as men rolling a sleeve before washing their hands. Water moved under the bank with a soft chuckle that sounded indecent given how long folks had been going empty. White Bull's people drifted down in 2s and 3s, carrying pots and bladders, faces cautious as deer in a new meadow. No one cheered. Hunger steals the part of you that wastes energy on joy. Bear and Reverend Thomas rode the fence line to where the path met the road to town. Jake Morrison was waiting there, reins looped in one hand, anger riding his shoulders like a too heavy saddle. "You had to poke the wolf," he said. "Wolves got to learn the flock kicks back," Bear answered. Jake's gaze went past them to the river. "Hardwell's been on the telegraph. Says you trespassed. Says you incited theft." "Of water?" Thomas asked. Jake's laugh didn't have mirth in it. "Of his peace." He looked at Bear, and beneath the duty Bear saw his friend, scared for him. He asked the judge for a warrant. "What did the judge say?" "He said he'd consider it." Jake rubbed his chin. "Which means he's counting money." Bear shifted in his saddle. "How long do I have before someone tries to make me into a lesson?" "Until Hartwell finishes his breakfast," Jake said. "He rides after that." They all knew what that meant. Hartwell liked to do his own hunting, when the quarry was a man he could humiliate in front of others. He wore a coat the color of lawsuit paper, and a smile that never reached both cheeks. He would come with 5 men who believed the saddle under them was a throne because they never had to clean it. "Then we choose our ground," Bear said. "Choose mercy too," the Reverend added, and his eyes asked for something large enough to cover their own fear. They rode to the old cottonwood, where the road bent around a low hill. There was a dry fork there that made a shallow basin. Bear marked the angles, measured where a horse would shy from a sudden shadow, counted heartbeats between where a man thought he was safe and where he realized he was not. He didn't dig a hole or stack a stone. He just turned his horse and waited where the wind could bring him the first hint of Hartwell's cologne. They heard him before they saw him, a chorus of leather and bit, men talking too loud because they liked the way words sounded when they expected to be obeyed. Hartwell rode in the middle, hat tipped just so, fancy revolver riding his hip like a pet. He saw Bear and smiled like a boy seeing a frog he wanted to prod with a stick. "Morning, mister." He let it hang, picking at the word like a scab. "Bear, is it?" "Seems apt." "Morning, Mr. Hartwell," Bear said. "Seems a man with that many syllables in his name would need less water to wash them all." Hartwell's men chuckled, because they were supposed to, then looked to see if Hartwell wanted them to stop. His smile flattened. "You cut my fence?" "I opened a gate," Bear replied. "For 2 hours. You don't get to set clocks on my land." "The river will," Bear said. Hartwell leaned forward, reins creaking in his gloves. "Law says otherwise." "Law that strangles mercy," Reverend Thomas said from the shade of the cottonwood, "was written by a small hand." Hartwell flicked a glance his way. "Preacher, you ought to mind your hymns." "My hymns mind me," Thomas answered. "That's how I know when I'm in the wrong key." Jake Morrison rode up then on the far side, breath a little tight from hurrying. He didn't wear his badge proud in that moment. He wore it like a weight. He spoke before Hartwell claimed the air. "Cletus, you got your parley. Here it is, in plain speech. You fence the river, you steal from every man, woman, and child, be they Comanche or farmer. I won't be swearing out a warrant against a man who opened a gate so children could drink." Hartwell's eyes cooled. "Then you ain't the law no more, Jake." Jake tugged his brim. "Maybe I'm what the law keeps forgetting to be." "Well," Hartwell said lightly, "there's more than one way to fix forgetfulness." He nodded, and 2 of his men stepped their horses off the road, flanking to put Bear in a mouth that would bite shut. The other 3 shifted hands on their reins and rested palms on grips, as if their fingers got cold easy. Bear lowered his heel and let his dun back 1/2 step, subtle as a thought. In the same motion, the cottonwood shadow slid across Hartwell's horse's eye as the sun came out from behind a puff of cloud. The animal danced, left a hair. One flanker hesitated, just a breath. It was enough to find the seam in their certainty. "Cletus," Bear said, "you think the day ends with you walking away having taught us fear. But the day has its own ideas." Hartwell grinned. "Enlighten me." Bear took a breath and let it out slow. He could end it here. He could draw first, put a hole in the dirt by Hartwell's boot, and make the man blink in front of his boys. He could hurt one of them in a way that would shout louder than reason. Instead, he did something harder. He holstered his will. He opened his hands, empty. "I ain't drawing on you," Bear said. "I won't break the thing I'm here to show." "What's that?" Hartwell asked, puzzled enough to lean a fraction forward. "That mercy can be a choice a man has to wake up with." Hartwell's nostrils flared. He didn't trust words that didn't come dressed in victory. "And if I don't share your faith?" "Then you'll still have to ride past me to take a child's water," Bear answered. "And every man here will have to know what he helped you be." He looked at each of Hartwell's riders in turn. "Not as a dare. As a naming. Tell me you don't have a memory of being thirsty." One man flinched. Another found something interesting in his stirrup leather. Hartwell saw it. Small cracks people pretend are part of the design. His smile thinned. "You think you're clever? You think you pinned me to a choice I can't make without losing in front of my men?" Hartwell's voice stayed mild, even as a muscle jumped in his jaw. He turned his horse an inch, and then turned it back, like a man checking the latch on a door before walking away from it. "All right then. 2 hours are up. We'll fetch wire and fix the cut. You can go on home and write sermons to each other about how good you feel." You'll open the gate every morning, Bear said. Not a question. Hartwell laughed. Or what, preacher's boy? You'll stand here forever. Until spring floats enough grass, Bear replied, or until you stand a judge in the river and ask him what belongs to whom. Hartwell's smile cracked at last. You don't set my schedule. No, Reverend Thomas said. Hunger does. Hartwell looked past them, toward the bend where figures moved with pails. He suffered the sight a second, then snatched his eyes back to bear the way a man pulls his hand off a stove. You think because you didn't draw on me, I owe you something. You think mercy's a bill I didn't agree to pay. He leaned close enough Bear could see the little white scar by his ear, where a barber slipped once. Here's my mercy. I don't hang you from that cottonwood for trying to shame me. I let you ride out of this county so you can teach ducks to pray somewhere else. Bear nodded, as if the man had ordered a coffee. I can ride. Jake sucked a tooth. Bear's fine, Bear said. Some prices you pay with your boots, not your blood. He looked at Hartwell. But you'll open that gate. Every morning. Because if you don't, Reverend Thomas will ride into town and ring the bell at noon each day until it breaks. Pete Morrison will bring every thirsty cow in the county and stand EM at your fence for the photographers. And I will write a letter so simple, even the judge can understand it. And I'll send it to the newspaper in Abilene. And they'll spell your name right beside the word child. Hartwell held the stare a long moment. Then he barked a laugh that didn't find a home anywhere in the morning. You're a romantic fool. I'm a stubborn one, Bear said. Hartwell jerked his chin. His men eased their horses back. Get off my road. Bear moved. Not quickly. Just enough. He felt Jake's relief, like a breeze. He felt Reverend Thomas's prayer go up, thin and fierce as blue smoke. He felt something else too, the ache that comes when you do not get to take the revenge that would have tasted sweet in your mouth for one hot second. Mercy is a hunger that goes on eating the parts of you that want to win the way a bully wins. They let Hartwell pass. They watched the men nod to the guard at the fence and fetch wire. They watched a gate close on a flow that would still be there tomorrow if they made enough noise to make tomorrow listen. That afternoon, Bear returned to town. Pete Morrison leaned in the livery doorway with a piece of straw and a look that said he'd been counting clouds while pretending not to be worried. You kicked a beehive, Pete said. Bees needed the practice, Bear replied. He cinched his saddle and loosened it again because his hands liked the work. Pete spat the straw and fetched another. Jake says Hartwell told you to ride out. Jake hears straight. You going? Suppose I am. Pete studied his boots. Suppose it's a shame. Bear looked up at the sign creaking above the livery. Morrison and Sons, painted by someone who ran out of patience before he ran out of letters. Thanks for the roof. You're paid up in my mind, Pete said. And my mind ain't famous for math. He hesitated. Hartwell came by. Stood where you're standing. Smiled at me like he was checking to see if my teeth were all present. Said if I give you a bed tomorrow, I give him a favor. Said I might want to consider my business friendships. Pete crushed the straw in his hand. Never wanted to know what my spine was made of so bad. You stood, Bear said. I wobbled, Pete admitted. Then I thought about my ma and the way she'd look at me if I didn't. He blinked hard. I'm sorry, Bear. You ain't the one took the river's name off the map, Bear said. He clapped Pete's shoulder and felt his own heart do the strange thing it does when it both hurts and gets bigger. Keep an eye on Jake. I always do, Pete said. He's liable to give away his boots if a man says his feet are cold. Bear smiled and walked across to the church. Reverend Thomas waited on the steps, chewing a notion like it was tough jerky. "You can sleep in the vestibule tonight," the Reverend said. "I'll not have you ride with the moon tangled in your stirrup." Bear shook his head. "I ride now." Thomas's mouth folded into a line that had held funerals and christenings alike. "You could stay and let me talk sense to pride tomorrow." "Your sense is a fine carven knife," Bear said. "But Hartwell's pride has the thickness of green wood. It'll only split with time and a wedge from the Lord." Thomas huffed. "You make a very inconvenient kind of sense." He thrust a paper-wrapped bundle into Bear's hands. "Bread. Dried apples. A little verse I wrote on the margin, for you to ignore until you don't want to." Bear tucked the bundle deep. "I'll miss your bad coffee." "Everyone does," Thomas said gravely. His eyes went to the west. "Before you go, someone wishes to see you." She came from around the corner of the building, small and wrapped in a dark shawl that made her eyes look even larger. Broken Arrow walked to him like a person who had learned to make each step count, not because she wanted to be graceful, but because life had made clumsiness expensive. Behind her was a presence that filled space without moving, Chief White Bull in the shade of a cottonwood that had chosen town as its strange home. Broken Arrow held out something wrapped in leather. Bear took it and found a small bundle of willow switches tied with sinew. A child's toy, the beginning of a hoop, or the beginning of a snare, or a path, if you held it like a circle and looked through. White Bull spoke, voice low, the words like stones smoothed in a river. "My daughter says the man who opens a gate should carry a path with him. She says a circle is a way to remember that mercy comes back to the hand that gives it. She says you will need reminding when your hunger speaks louder than your patience." Bear's throat went tight. "Tell her I will carry it." White Bull's eyes measured him the way a man measures a beam to see if it will hold the roof. "I told Hartwell a thing today," the chief said. "I told him if he locked the river again so that a child's lips went dry, I would come into his yard and take down his fence post by post while singing to his cattle about water. I told him I would bring my old singers and we would sing for days." Bear smiled despite himself. "That might do it." White Bull's mouth twitched. He does not like music unless he is the one choosing the song. The chief's gaze drifted toward the road that leaned west out of town. "You will ride away because you have decided to pay the price mercy set on your table. But prices change when people who love you decide to share them." He nodded toward Jake Morrison in the distance. "The deputy will be trouble to himself now. He will have to decide if your leaving makes him smaller or if standing his ground makes him larger." "I'd not bet against Jake," Bear said. "No," White Bull agreed. "But Hartwell will." He put his palm to Bear's chest, just once, a weight that went in deeper than skin. "Be a stubborn one. It is a kind that outlasts men who burn hot." Bear tipped his hat to the chief, to the girl, to the Reverend counting their blessings with the solemnity of a man who knows how quickly they can be spent. He swung into the saddle. As he turned his horse, Broken Arrow lifted a hand. The motion was small, and it took all the strength she had, and it was more than enough to tell him the world sometimes chose right, and sometimes it needed help. He rode out with the sun behind him. The road led two ways at once, the direction he faced and the one his heart kept glancing back toward. He didn't look back, because he believed in the kind of leaving that trusts other people to hold a thing without you staring at their hands. He camped at the edge of the greasewood that night, the ground smelling of dust and old rain. He lit a small fire and ate the reverend's bread, and he read the verse scrawled on the folded margin, "Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly," and he argued with it the way you argue with someone you respect. When the stars shouldered up into their positions, he lay back and let the sky press the day into a shape he could carry. Morning brought hoofbeats. He heard them before he rose, a cadence too careful to be strangers. Jake Morrison rode into the camp, coat dusted, eyes sleep-starved and bright. He swung down and didn't bother with "How do you, Doss?" He thrust out a folded sheet. "Judge says there ain't a warrant after all." Bear took it. It was a miracle written in bad ink. He grow a conscience overnight. He read the telegram from Abilene that reporter friend of Reverend Thomas's sent, Jake said. "Seems your letter traveled faster than Hartwell's temper." Bear raised an eyebrow. "I never wrote a letter." Jake grinned a little. "Preacher did. Signed your name. Said the Lord would forgive him for forgery if the judge didn't." The smile slipped. "But Hartwell ain't done." Bear looked past Jake at the line where the land knitted itself to the sky. "He rarely is." Jake sat on his heels. "I told Pete I'm riding out with you." "You can't," Bear said. "Town needs a deputy who remembers what the badge is for." "Badge is for remembering mercy even when it smells like weakness," Jake said quietly. "I learned that from you and Reverend Thomas. But there's another lesson, standing next to a friend when the road tries to thin him out." Bear's laugh was soft. "You're a trouble." Jake shrugged. "So are you." He stared at the little fire. "Hartwell came to me last night. He said if I didn't arrest you for trespass, he'd get the judge to call me derelict and empty my office. I told him I'd sweep the floor for Pete and still wear the law where it belongs." "And where's that?" Bear asked. Jake tapped his chest. "Right here. Where it can rub a hole in your pride." He blew out a breath. "I ain't leaving town for good. Just for 2 days. We'll ride to the ridge, look back, and come home. Between now and then, I figure Hartwell will either get used to the sound of that gate opening, or he'll ride out to close it himself. And if he does, I'd like to be present to remind him what he looks like in the reflection of a river." Bear thought about arguing. Then he thought about the way men can hold each other up, by standing where the other man can see him. "All right." He kicked dirt over the last coal. 2 days. They rode west and then south, paralleling the river. They saw the gate open at dawn like a mouth that had decided to tell the truth. They saw 2 of Hartwell's men losing at cards on the tailgate of a freight wagon and not enjoying the taste of humility. They saw White Bull's people organized now, women and men moving in the quiet rhythm of survival when it becomes a craft. At noon of the second day, they turned back. The land felt different in their eyes, though nothing had moved but water and wind. Sometimes the world changes because people stand in it in a new way. Sometimes it changes because men who thought they were alone are seen. They reached the cottonwood at last light. There, on the low hill, a single rider waited. Hartwell. No escort. No smile. His hat was pushed back a little, as if sincerity had surprised him on the trail, and he hadn't had time to rearm himself with guile. He didn't speak first. That privilege he allowed to the men who had walked out to meet him yesterday without a gun in their fists. "I opened the gate," Hartwell said at last. "We saw," Bear replied. Hartwell squinted into the low sun as if he were measuring a different light than the one on the land. "I'll open it again tomorrow." He shifted in the saddle, impatient with himself. I do not consent to your view of me. You don't have to, Jake said. You can become it. Hartwell made a small, helpless motion with his hand. You too are unbearable. Yes, Bear said. And patient. Hartwell's gaze flicked, quick as a rabbit. I didn't come to be forgiven. I don't want your sermons. But I came to say this, you didn't win. Bear nodded. That's right. Hartwell blinked. You're supposed to argue. We never set out to win, Bear said. We set out to make sure a child didn't drink dust. Hartwell's shoulders fell a fraction. That, at least, you managed. He looked past them toward the ribbon of river, and something in his expression softened. Not much, like frost learning the shape of a leaf. There's a herd coming up from the south. If the rains hold, I can push them east across the flats and not scrap the grass. If they don't hold, he broke off. He was not a man used to letting uncertainty borrow his breath. If they don't hold, I suppose we'll talk again. We will, Reverend Thomas said from behind the tree where he'd been standing in the patience of old men who know their time will be asked for again and again. He stepped forward now and put out his hand. When you decide to like the sound of decent things, come by the church. The coffee's terrible, and the company improves it. Hartwell stared at the offered palm, as if it were the trigger of a contraption designed by a mischievous god. He did not take it. But he didn't turn away either. I'll consider it, he said, which was as new a word as he had spoken in some years. He gathered his reins, then paused. You leaving town then, Bear? For a while. Hartwell's mouth clicked. Good. He hesitated. Not for forever, mind. He spurred his horse and went, the lion of his shoulders saying nothing anyone could pin to paper, and yet everything a man could read if he'd been studying hardness long enough to recognize it starting to unlearn itself. They watched him go. Jake blew out a breath. Maybe the Lord does small miracles when you're not looking. Reverend Thomas snorted. He does them when you stare rudely too. But he likes company. Bear tied the small willow circle to his saddle horn where the light could find it. He looked toward the river, toward town, toward the notch in the hills that had learned his name from the soles of his boots. When he turned his horse, he felt the moral price settle proper in him. The cost of mercy paid not once in blood, but every day in the coin of patience and humility. Let's go home, he said. They rode in, 3 men in a circle of willow, and a story that would keep choosing its ending every time someone woke up and decided whether to drink alone or share. When Bear came to the livery, Pete had a stall swept and a grin too big for his face. When he passed the church, Reverend Thomas' door was open, and the smell of bad coffee climbed the steps like a hymn, determined to hit all the wrong notes until they sounded right. And when Bear crossed the street in the wash of evening light, Broken Arrow and White Bull stood at the edge of town the way guardians stand at the edge of an idea that has decided to live. The girl lifted her hand and drew a small circle in the air. Bear answered it with the brim of his hat. The wind changed. It smelled like something cooking that didn't come from ashes. The sign above the livery clapped once, and the sound was pleased with itself. Bear touched the bundle at his saddle and found the dry apples and a scrap of folded margin. He didn't need to read the words to know them now. He turned toward the river in his mind and opened the gate again. And then again. And then again.